So, Krystal, one of the things that I've always wanted to say to you is that I'm super jealous of your name because it's so witchy. It's so witchy. It's like the witchiest name I've ever heard in my life. What's your astrology sign, by the way? I always ask our guests this question.
I'm a Sagittarius. My birthday is actually coming up, November 24th. Wow. Sometimes it's on Thanksgiving. It is not on Thanksgiving this year. But I think I'm one of those, like, I'm right on the line of another sign.
Yeah, it's like a cusp. I don't know. I should know this, but I don't. So I'm a bad witch. I should know it too.
It's my birthday, but I don't know. Yeah. You know, the funny thing...
I am under no obligation to know any of this.
People always want to know the story of my name. So you didn't ask, but I will tell it anyway. It is my real name. People always want to know that to start with.
Wow.
And it's my given name. My parents actually did that to me.
So cool.
And the funny thing is, people always assume they were like super hippies or something like that, but they actually really were not. My mom was actually like a nun, literal Catholic nun during the 60s, which is interesting in and of itself. My dad is the one, though, who named me. My mom named my two older sisters. They both got relatively normal names, Holly and Heidi. And when it came to me, I'm the youngest. She let my dad pick. And she and my dad and an aunt of mine had a conversation while my mom was pregnant with me of like, haha, what names could you put with Ball? Like base and basket and butter. And my aunt suggested Krystal. And my dad, like, they all laughed, but he actually kind of liked that. And he he's a physicist, and his PhD dissertation had something to do with crystals. So that kind of, resonated with him as well.
Wow.
So he picked the name. My mom's stipulation was to make it with a K, to give it that extra, like, porn star vibe.
Just
so here we are.
I mean, your destiny was obviously to be a crime-fighting witch, but you chose to go the politics route.
There's still time. You never know. There's still time.
Well, thank you so much for coming, Krystal. We're super excited to have you today. Would you like, for those of our audience members who haven't heard of you, would you like to sort of introduce yourself?
Sure. This always stresses me out. Tell me your life story. Only the relevant, interesting parts. So what I do now is I'm the host of a show called Rising. It's put on by The Hill, and most people watch it on YouTube. I'm the left half of the pairing. It's myself and Sagar and Jetty, who's on the right. I'm sort of like a Bernie Sanders type leftist. He's like a populist right type Trump person. And so we have conversations that are different than probably what happens anywhere else. The areas of agreement can be really surprising and interesting. He agrees a lot with me about certainly corporate power, money in politics, quite a bit of economic policy. And we have wildly different views on almost every social cultural issue that you can think of, reaction to the protest, all of those sorts of things. So that's Rising. Prior to that, I got into politics in a way that I would have until recently described as unusual, but I actually don't think it is that unusual. You saw a lot of people in the Trump era who jumped headfirst into politics who hadn't been involved before. And that was me back in 2008, 9, 10. So, I'm about to be 39 years old. The Bush era and the Iraq War was incredibly formative to me. And that really was my introduction, not just into the, atrocious decisions and cruel decision making and a lot of times bipartisan fashion that was happening in DC, but also the endemic corruption that was governing so much of what was going on in our entire country with both political parties. So I decided, having never run for office before or worked on a campaign or anything, to run for Congress in 2010. I was not successful, but I got some what was really unwanted publicity at the time of these stupid party photos of me that really, if you look back now, it's like the tamest scandal of all time. I'm fully clothed. I'm of age. Like,
You're not in blackface.
none of it is all that, it's all, I'm just drinking out of a red cup and it's like sort of sexy and salacious. And so everyone melted down about this at the time, right? Now it seems like absolutely nothing. But anyway, this ended up giving me a lot of media attention. And so after I lost the campaign, places like MSNBC and Fox continued to have me on. And so I sort of landed in this accidental media career. I ended up as a host on MSNBC for a number of years. And that's kind of what set me on my current trajectory. as you
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us. And I mean, one of the things that I found the most interesting about observing the Hill and the stuff that goes on there is the difference of perspective between you and your co-host, which I actually find very refreshing. Obviously, like the populist left and the populist right are sort of on the margins in a way that mainstream neoliberal politics isn't. So I always find it very refreshing when there's dialogue, even though there's obvious clear disagreements. But I always find it very interesting and refreshing when there's dialogue between these two kind of spheres. How would you say it's been covering the election on a network that has multiple perspectives, that are present? That's something that's very rare. It's usually slanted one way or another.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, at times we agree a lot. I mean, I think we both are sort of assessment of the mistakes that Trump has made, especially with regards to coronavirus. We're on the same page on. We're definitely on the same page in the sort of like uninspiring, lackluster nature of Joe Biden's campaign. How pathetic it is, frankly, that he could win a landslide election by basically being like, I'm going to wear a mask and not be a total asshole. That's the entirety of his campaign platform, So we're on the same page with a lot of that. What's been more definitely uncomfortable and challenging was at the height of the protests, his view of law enforcement and the actions that the president should have taken in that regard is, diametrically opposed to mine.
Yeah.
That's obviously like, issues of racial justice, like this incredibly fraught, difficult personal issue to get through. And so, I think in a lot of ways, the very concept of our show is somewhat controversial. And I understand that because these issues are real to people and they have real world impacts on people's lives. But I, on a couple levels, reject the idea that we should just not talk to people who hold views, even views that we find to be abhorrent and objectionable.
Yeah, absolutely.
Number one, first and foremost, I don't think that it works, right?
No.
We just had this whole Hunter Biden email thing fiasco. And what happened? So the story wasn't actually getting that much attention in the New York Post. And then Twitter tried to censor it and make it so no one could share it. And immediately the thing blew up because, of course, the minute that you say, like, you can't look at that thing, we can't talk about that thing, we can't look at it, everyone's like, what is it? Let's talk about it. What's going on? What are you trying to hide? And I think that's perfectly emblematic of an approach of just trying to push people whose views, again, you may find to be not just offensive or wrong, but actually like abhorrent, just pushing them out of the mainstream and pretending like they don't exist. Now, look, there's a limit to that. Do I think that someone like Richard Spencer deserves a platform to engage with? No, I don't. But when you're talking about views that are relatively widely held and held and articulated by the President of the United States, I think if we're going to have a country and try to have a multiracial working class coalition, which is the politics that I believe in, I don't think you get there by shunning and shaming and putting blinders on and pretending those views don't exist. So that's, a central ethos of our project that we work on every day on Rising. And one other thing that I'll say on this is you hear a lot about like, oh, you're providing a gateway to the alt-right, or you're like platforming these views. But no one ever talks about, okay, but we also are providing a way out of that.
Yes, exactly.
And so we hear from a lot of people because we do have diverse perspectives. We really try to represent the entire ideological spectrum. We have viewers who have views all across the gamut. And since they have some level of trust and respect of Sagar and I that, we're going to call on our own side. We're going to be honest about what we think is going on. They've actually moderated their views from those scary right-wing extreme perspectives and sort of come back. And we've also heard a lot from people who say, I couldn't even talk to my friend, brother, uncle, aunt, dad, whoever about politics anymore. And this has given us kind of a common language to be able to at least start to have those conversations and re-engage. So that's a piece of it that I feel really good about. And listen, it is definitely challenging at times. It'd be easier if I just had someone who was like, you're right, that we absolutely agreed on basically everything. But that's the piece that I think makes it interesting and different and hopefully beneficial and productive.
I totally agree. I find it incredibly compelling, but there's sort of this odd trend on the left where if you're talking to somebody who doesn't have the exact same political views as you, or who holds views that people may view as objectionable, people sort of think that you get those views by osmosis almost.
Yeah.
And I mean, in real life, like you said, these are widely held opinions. These are things that a lot of people believe, and I feel like not engaging cedes a lot of territory to more pernicious forms of politics, especially when the metric that everyone seems to fawn over is that of purity. It's quite a disturbing trend, and it's been really refreshing to watch you and your co-hosts have these open discussions, and while also remaining respectful towards each other and each other's positions. It's so rare to see such an emergence in alternative media. But moving on, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the election. Obviously, it's been quite fraught. Sure. It's been an incredibly fraught election. It's been a fraught period. Tensions are running high. I wondered if you have any speculations right now. Do you sort of have any speculations about what you think is going to happen at this point?
To me, it looks very unlikely like Trump could pull off a victory at this point. I mean, look, if I'm going to play devil's advocate, if there was going to be a year where the polls were wildly off, right? Because at this point, we're not talking about the kind of error that we had in 2016, okay? If you look at the numbers, and I'm stealing this from Kyle Kulinski, who said this on our show the other day. If you look at the numbers, if you move the polls the same amount in Trump's favor this time around that they were wrong in 2016, it still ends up with a Biden-like landslide, still not even close with that type of error. However, if you were going to have a year where there was wild uncertainty and a wild swing in the polls, it would be this year, just because here we are in this pandemic. People are voting in ways that they've never voted before. There's going to be all kinds of court challenges of ballots. We know from watching the way the primaries unfolded, there will be a certain percentage of mail-in ballots that get thrown out. All of those things, if you have the turnout model a little bit wrong, and then you also have mail-in ballots disproportionately for Biden getting thrown out, you never know what could happen. So let me just throw that caveat in there. However, at this point, what we've seen is a very key group has gone to Biden, which is the people that hate both the candidates last time around. Those people disproportionately either went to Trump or voted third party. People who voted third party last time are tending to go to Biden. People who didn't vote last time are tending to go to Biden, and there are so few undecideds remaining. So yes, we have a debate coming up, but there's so few people out there who are still scratching their head going, am I going to vote for Biden or Trump? That almost anything could happen between now and Election Day, and I don't think it would really significantly shift things. You're seeing states like Iowa, like Georgia, like Texas in play for the Biden campaign, and I really think as likely Trump winning is as likely an outcome as Biden winning like Texas and having this just like insane electoral margin. And I think at the end of the day, it just comes down to bottom line, people wanted Trump and gave him a chance to show up on coronavirus, and not even, the bar wasn't even that high, right? Just take it seriously. Just like try to get this thing under control, project some level of competence and leadership, and he's just wholly and completely unable to do it. He's gotten on the wrong side. How do you get on the wrong side of wearing a mask, right? This is an 80-20 issue. This is not like a divided issue. Even majority of Republicans support wearing a freaking mask. And so that's part of what's, again, so depressing about this campaign is because he's been so ridiculous and so outrageously outside of public opinion. Joe Biden doesn't even talk about policy. He doesn't have to talk about policy. All he has to do is like show him wearing a mask and taking this seriously. And everyone's like, that's the guy. Let's do it. I mean, it's better than what we've got right now. So I think that's where we are.
Yeah, he's also managed to, not be as offensive as Hillary Clinton was to the sensibilities of the opposing side, which I think is something. I've been paying attention to the polling in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, the big states from the previous election. And he's generally outside of margin of error with reputable polling. The thing that I think that there is to sort of quote unquote worry about, I don't really personally see the neoliberal project going one way or the other, depending on who wins. But the thing I think that people who care about Biden need to care about is the idea of the silent majority. The people who don't participate until the day. Is that what
like
do
the
you
shy
think?
Trump people?
Yes, the shy Trump folks. What do you think about those folks?
I certainly think that is a possible phenomenon that could move the polls. Again, couple points, right? I would spot Trump a couple of points in all these polls. But even if you do that, you've still got Biden in a pretty commanding position, especially in those states that you talk about. And look, I do think that partly I think Biden has some goodwill in Michigan and the other industrial Midwestern states because he's so closely associated with the auto bailout. I do think that is a help for him, even though, he backed NAFTA, he still backs TPP. These things, which were really effective blows against Hillary, just, first of all, Trump hasn't even bothered really to make the case. So there's that. And second of all, because of his association with the auto bailout and his just kind of ability to affect, blue collar guy, Scranton Joe, I think he's been forgiven for that. And look, some of it is the Hillary people like to paint this all as like, oh, it was 100% sexism. I don't buy that whatsoever. But I do think there's for sure a gender dynamic where Joe Biden just goes down easier for white working class men than Hillary Clinton did.
One of the things,
oh, for sure.
One of the things that I'm very concerned about around this election is sort of the position of the left. And by the left, I mean sort of the workerist kind of populist left. Under a Biden presidency, it sort of seems as if we're going to have to deal with a lot of triumphalism from the neoliberal kind of constituency and the establishment, which could potentially further marginalize our position. And that's kind of a question that I wanted to ask you is, where do you think that sort of Bernie kind of momentum is going? Where do you think that's being, is it being funneled back into the DNC? What do you think is the potential for the left under a Biden presidency?
I'm hesitant to put too specific of a shape to that energy, but what I will say is that the current path is not sustainable, right? So you have a lot of sort of back to brunch neoliberals who think they're going to elect Joe Biden and like everything's going to be fine. And they can just go back to sleep and not have to pay attention to politics anymore. And I just don't think that that's a realistic path. First of all, for most of the country, before Trump wasn't so great. That's why we ended up with Donald Trump, because it wasn't so great. You had a lot of people who were struggling and suffering and felt unseen fundamentally by the American political system. And that's how you get Trump. Those problems are not going away. And in fact, those problems are greater than ever. The response to the pandemic has led to the greatest upward transfer of wealth that we've perhaps ever seen.
Yes.
The impact of the crash that we've had around the pandemic has been so lopsided that if you're in the top 10% of America, maybe even top 20% of America, you're fine and you don't even see it. You don't feel it. Stock market's doing great. which is why the political class here, why it's been invisible to them, because it's not their donor class, it's not their neighbors, it's not their friends. It's all just sort of theoretical pain.
Yep.
So this response and the impact of this has been just so outrageously unequal. So I think you have all these trends that led to Trump more, a greater and more exacerbated than ever. So Biden, with his incrementalist approach, obviously is not going to deal with those underlying trends. What does that translate into? I don't know exactly. And I don't want to put it like there's an inevitability around it either. You need a spark, you need galvanizing actions, you need leaders in a movement, you need all of those things. But I will say one thing specific, which is actually piece that I'm working on for the show. I was able to interview Senator Sanders today.
Oh, wow.
And I asked him this question. I said, okay, you say we're going to be able to move Biden. Like, what's the plan? And he said he's going to have his own 100 days plan. Like the Biden administration will have their 100 days plan, and Bernie Sanders is going to have his 100 days plan that he's going to try to organize, which I think is good, a good idea, and gives people something to sort of work on. But the muscle comes in really not until you look down the road at 2024. Yep. There was one opportunity to wield political power in this election and basically say, look, if you want us to vote for you against Donald Trump, you've got to actually do something real. That didn't happen. That opportunity was wasted, whatever you think of whether that would have been the right thing to do or not. That opportunity is gone. The next real thing where they will care at all what the left has to say is whether there's a primary challenge against either Joe or if it's Kamala next time around. And it doesn't even have to be a primary challenge that they perceive as likely to succeed, because they are so sensitive to any kind of dissent whatsoever. So if you have, and I asked Bernie about this as well, like, would you be open to backing a primary challenge if Joe doesn't measure up? And he said yes. So we need to push people to hold them to, actually backing a primary challenge, to actually being willing to challenge Joe Biden and Kamala Harris on these issues, because I really think that is the next. They don't care. If we complain, to be honest with you, they actually like it, because then they can go to like the Never Trumpers and be, see, the left is mad at us. Look at how moderate we are. They actually like that, right? It's a good dynamic for them. It's part of why why Joe and Kamala love to bash the Green New Deal and whatever, to be like, see, these leftists are so crazy. We're not like them.
Literally everything they do is based on like defining an opposite for themselves.
Yes.
It's literally like, look at them. We're not them.
We're not them. So, and that's been the Democratic Party since the 90s. This was the Bill Clinton counter-scheduling innovation. And so anyway, that's my latest thought, is the next place where there's a real power opportunity for the left is in that 2024 primary dynamic, which will start to assert itself very quickly.
I agree. One of the other questions that I wanted to ask you as well was sort of about the job and the role and the place of alternative, independent and left media under this potential regime. What do you think that the goals and the aspirations and the platforms that we should be sort of pushing at this moment should be? What do you think we should be focusing on intently underneath this a potential Biden regime?
I mean, I think the goal is always just honesty to me. Which is not something, I mean, it's so simple, but it's not something you get in mainstream elite media, because they all are partisan cheerleaders. So it's like, you turn to one channel and it's like, Democrats are always good and Republicans are always bad. The end. And you turn to another channel and it's the exact opposite dynamic. So to me, the role of independent media, and, we're sort of like in this weird zone. We kind of operate like independent.
You get to be alternative.
Yeah, alternative, whatever. But we're not actually. Anyway. But I always think of the role as like, number one, just actually being honest, whether it's convenient for your team or, the politicians that you admire or not. So, when I've had issues with Bernie Sanders' approach, I've certainly said that. Sagar has plenty of issues with Donald Trump's approach. He's certainly been upfront about that. And I think that's true throughout the alternative media ecosystem. And then I think the other piece is just to be brave in the conversations that we have and the topics that we're willing to touch and discuss, even when that is uncomfortable, even when it's potentially even like problematic. Because I think that's why you see the alternative media ecosystem growing so rapidly, is because it doesn't have all the boundaries and guardrails that traditional media has at this point, where you have to operate within this like very narrow confine. You're not allowed to say certain things, ask certain questions, all of that. I think because it's a more open and courageous conversation that's happening in independent media, that's why so many people are gravitating towards it. And it's only going to become more important. It's only going to become more it's going to become the new mainstream, especially with younger citizens who, don't even, to them, CNN and MSNBC and all this stuff is irrelevant at this point.
Very much so.
Absolutely.
Very much so. I feel like what we sort of are focusing on and what I'm sort of zeroing in on at the moment is the importance of class struggle, because it seems as if the inevitability of class struggle, because it seems as if everything is sort of trying to obfuscate or paper over these very sort of clear contradictions in our society. And those contradictions are only becoming more and more and more exacerbated as time goes on. And no matter what happens in this election, those contradictions are still going to be there. Like you said, they're still going to be there. And I feel like it's so important for us to sort of do the work of building right now, because without a left, you're inevitably going to see more right-wing populism, more other pernicious forms of ideology latching on to that sort of desire for class struggle, and sort of diverting that energy into more sort of boundlessly pernicious avenues. And that's kind of where I feel like a lot of the focus should be going. I mean, we're on the precipice of a huge economic catastrophe. We're seeing mass joblessness, mass homelessness, all kinds of different afflictions. I mean, in America specifically, the lack of healthcare. All of these different things are still problems that are really hurting people and their chances at a decent quality of life. And I feel like, if nothing else, there's a level of solace that people get from understanding that the problems they're experiencing are kind of validated, no matter what side of the political spectrum that they fall on. One of the things that I really admire about your trajectory and the relationship you have with your co-host is that the commonality is always sort of found within people's experience. And whenever I've spoken to right-wing people, one of the things that I realize is that they're not wrong they may come to conclusions that I believe to be wrong, but they're not wrong. The underlying sentiment and the underlying pain is based in reality. It's based in brick and mortar observations about things in society that are unfair. It's just that there's nothing available that's leading them towards better conclusions. And I feel like that's kind of the role that we need to occupy. I worry obviously neither candidate for me is something that would be a positive thing, but I do worry about, I feel like we're going to see sort of neoliberal triumphalism kick into overdrive almost if a Biden president.
No doubt about it.
Does that concern you at all?
Of course. I mean, and isn't it like when Hillary loses, it's not a judgment on neoliberalism. That was Russia, and it was there were a lot of other things. It had nothing to do with that. And once Joe Biden wins, then it's going to see, neoliberalism. It's great. It's amazing. It's what people want. It's here to stay. Even as if you look,
it's the best. Many people are saying.
Right, exactly. Even as if you look at the polling, like. New polling just came out, research from PRRI. Okay, affordable universal childcare is an 80-something% issue, including a majority of Republicans. Free college is a 70-something% issue. Okay, UBI 70-something% issue.
I mean, that was first introduced by the right on the national stage. Like, that was a Richard Nixon proposal. Like,
true.
It's so ridiculous that that is it's honestly a milquetoast thing. But like the idea that it's divisive is just no.
So this is the real mainstream of America. These are positions that are held across the political spectrum, and many self-identified Republicans agree with, especially free college and affordable childcare, tested, extraordinarily positively. So we have to stay focused on the reality of where people actually are, what their views truly are, not what are actually radical views that are typically represented in government. And to your point on class struggle, one of the things that we really have to focus on is rebuilding the labor movement. Because if you want to unite workers in this class struggle, the place where you have the least segregation by race, the place where you have the most sort of cross-partisan conversations is in the union hall. And so part of why we're in such a difficult position right now is because that whole structure has been so obliterated. And I really think central to any successful left movement project, the labor movement has to be put at the center of any of those efforts is absolutely essential.
With the labor movement, how do we get beyond the fact that the concept of the employee has been so radically destroyed? We're in a situation where we have so many independent contractors. People are like Uber drivers and various versions of that
don't forget
job.
OnlyFans.
Porn Uber, YouTube video Uber, et cetera, et cetera. Almost nobody actually works for anyone but themselves. How do we organize that? It's something that I've thought about a lot for the last couple of years, and I just don't know where we go with that.
I mean, I think in part it requires legislation to define, to clarify what an employee and who an employee actually is. Obviously, there's lawsuits ongoing that are going through the courts with regards to Uber in particular. But I think legislation is necessary to clarify that just on the basic nuts and bolts level. I am a fan and proponent of sectoral bargaining so that it's less on, each individual shop and more on industry-wide setting standards. That's been more successful in other countries. And I think especially given the landscape of, American workers at this point, that probably has more promise than the way that we do things now, which again would require legislation, which kind of brings us back to the original source of the problem. Now, what I will say is hopeful is labor unions have never been more popular. In absolutely. Modern American history. There's massive appetite. There's massive interest. Young Americans in particular, very interested and very supportive of the labor movement. So the want and the desire is there. But not only, look, it's hard to get, this was one of the, again, failures of the Obama administration, who ran on the Employee Free Choice Act, which would have made it a lot easier to organize. And ultimately they put up a perfunctory, sure, we support that. And it didn't go anywhere and they never fought hard for it. That's kind of what I expect to continue. That's what I expect to continue. Biden also has good plans. If you look at his plans on labor unions, you'd be yes, this is good. I support this. Will he actually expend political capital, get it done? I don't know. That's where the outside pressure has to come in and has to make it painful to not back those reforms. Yeah, because I don't think there's there isn't any getting there without changing by law some of that landscape.
I agree. And unfortunately, the platform itself is filled with a lot of things that are very hard to get somebody who doesn't have prior knowledge as to the situation, maybe a little bit out of the loop because maybe they work every day or something like that, to get them excited about and to form a voting bloc or to create a pressure group to exert. That's the thing that I think really. Well,
one counter example I will give to that is the teachers movement. So this was a massive labor movement. And I was there on the ground in West Virginia. I was in Kentucky where I used to live. These are states. It was a lot of red states, too. It was Arkansas as well had a big teachers movement, Arizona as well. So these were red states where you had workers come together, and West Virginia and Kentucky in particular have a huge history, and like the bedrock of their sort of ethos revolves around solidarity and labor unions and that type of working class populist organizing. So that like muscle memory was all there. In fact, with the very first teacher strikes in West Virginia, they were in Mingo County, I believe, was the first county to go. And this is one of the poorest counties in the entire country. Very proud and storied history in terms of the United Mine Workers there, and the mine wars and all of that went down in Mingo and the surrounding area. And in this meeting of Mingo teachers, there were actually some of those, you know, old hands from the mines, the UMWA guys who got in there and kind of like coached them and gave them advice about how to approach it and how to stay strong and how to stand shoulder to shoulder and get ultimately what they want. So that was all there. And that movement didn't get nearly enough coverage, I thought, in the national press, because it didn't have a neat like Trump angle to it. You know, it wasn't really about Trump. So the national newsroom was like, yeah, who cares? It's not about Trump, so we're not going to pay attention to it.
It's not going to be
funny. But to me, there's a spark. There's a spark of something very important and promising there, because the desire for, the appetite for, the ability to create out of very little, you know, a workers' movement like that, that's been demonstrated on a national scale. So the possibility and the promise is in fact there, even if we can't exactly see it at this moment.
Well, as they say,
that's good to hear.
As they say, necessity is the mother of invention, and I feel like as things get more and more desperate, we're going to have to find solutions. And one of the things that I've seen is this sort of pernicious effort to decentralize the idea that the left is based upon class politics. And there's also this sort of, and especially now that the neoliberal triumphalism is kicking into overgear, there's this sort of you silly socialists with your revolution. Nobody actually wants that. People just want this sort of miasma of stability, this sort of veneer of civility. And I find it very...
They want to go back to the end of history.
Yeah, basically. The Fukuyamaist end of history.
Can we go back to the end?
I find it very difficult to penetrate that sort of false consciousness. What have been your experiences with this false consciousness? Is this something that you've noticed?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And this is part of what is, again, so sad about the Biden campaign is Trump has been so awful and obnoxious, and people are just sick of this guy, right? And so the let's go back to normal thing, especially for who is the beating heart of the Biden coalition? It's like affluent, mostly white suburbanites, for whom the Obama era was pretty good. You know, things were going pretty well for them. So to rewind back to that mythical 2012 age, like that seems great to them. And that's why that group of people is so ultimately enthusiastic about Joe Biden. And it's also partly why I'm very skeptical about forming a successful political coalition with the sort of back to brunch liberal whose greatest hope and desire is to not have to pay attention to politics anymore and just go back to like the easy, calm life where they are whispered to by all the culture that they are special and they deserve to have better than everybody else. Kids deserve to have better. Like, so like that's the goal, is just, can I not have to think about politics? Can I just go back to 2012 and put it on autopilot? And I've seen in Virginia, which is my home state and where I live now, what that politics ultimately looks like when translated into power. So Virginia, all the time I was growing up there, was a red state, very conservative. Now, because the Northern Virginia suburbs are so dominant, it has become a blue state. And the governor's mansion and both houses are held by Democrats. So Democrats can do whatever they want in the state of Virginia, right?
And one might
yet,
expect.
With Democrats in complete control, Virginia is still 51 out of 51 in terms of worker rights. So now they've done things that I support, like passing the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment. They've passed, they've addressed Confederate monuments on some level. They've done they've done a lot of socially, culturally liberal things, which are important, but they have not done anything that will change the balance of power and who's right and right that's going to threaten anyone's class is the bottom line.
Exactly.
So,
like you could sort of compare that with the supermajority that the Democrats had when passing the ACA, which ultimately brought us down from 50 million people without health care to 35 million people without health care. Such a huge accomplishment. I mean, it's a lot of people that have health care now, but it's a lot more that don't. And ultimately, I think, like, just to aid your point there, like, we see that on all levels. We see that exact same thing. You get Democrats in and you think, all right, we're in the good place. We're on our way. We need to trust the process. The process is that they still are embedded in corporate interests. Like, they're still taking money from those people. They're still aided by super PACs.
That's what this type of politics ultimately leads you to. Now, if you poll Northern Virginia liberals on economic issues, they'll give you a lot of answers that you feel good about. I mean, probably a lot of them would say, sure, I support Medicare for all. Sure, I support, universal child care. They probably have good answers on these issues. Will they ever actually prioritize them? Will they ever actually hold politicians to account who don't fight for those issues? Will they ever be at the top of the agenda? No, never. And so therein lies the challenge. So yes, back to your original question, for a certain class of liberal, just going back to brunch is great for them. That's all they really aspire to. And part of what the big challenge is that so much of the Democratic Party has now been centered around that cohort and that coalition where, younger voters who tend to have a more policy-centric and more economic-centric view, a more power-centric view, tend to, hold politicians accountable, not based on just what team they are, but based on their policy positions. They're being sort of scorned and becoming apathetic and less attached to the Democratic Party. You've seen even in this election, I mean, even with Trump and all of his crap, like, he's still gaining ground with working class Latino and African Americans.
Yeah, big time.
Absolutely.
So you're pushing a lot of working class people out of the party and instead centering it around, like, John Kasich and like these affluent suburbanites. So it makes it a lot harder to focus on issues that deal directly with class, I think. I
mean, I'm one of the sort of disenfranchised Zoomer millennials. I don't know if that's where I would place myself that you're referring to. I mean, I have both American and British citizenship, so I have my feet on both sides of the pond, and it's been like a double kind of. I was quite active in the Corbyn campaign here in the UK, and I was really sort of, I had my heart, in the Bernie Sanders campaign as well, and it was trauma on both sides in that regard, and it does definitely make one feel disillusioned and disengaged from the electoral sphere, and especially when you feel like you have nothing to hope for or cling to, and when the people who you're being told to vote for are acting in absolute contempt of your class interests. These are people who are sprinkling sugar on bullshit and telling you it's ice cream. They're pissing on you and telling you that it's raining, and I feel I relate a lot to the people who have decided to not vote. I also relate a lot to the people who have completely fallen out of love and out of touch with the electoral process in that regard, especially this time around, because it's visceral in a way that it hasn't been in a long time because of the crisis that we're all finding ourselves in at the moment. I have friends who have recently become unemployed because of coronavirus on both sides of the pond, people who have lost their homes, people who have no idea what the future is going to look like, and then also just the general atomizing and the way that life is sort of shrinking, and our social commons has now been dominated by this sort of artificial form of engagement. There's so many things that people are feeling deprived of in this very moment, and to be faced with such a banal choice seems almost cruel. But one of the things I wanted to ask you about is this vote shaming thing that we see going on And also the fact that a lot of people who were very critical of the DNC in 2016 now seem to have sort of bent the knee, especially in the sort of media class. They seem to have sort of bent the knee because obviously it's a thing about credibility, in my opinion. Like, nobody wants to lose face or credibility. Everybody sort of wants to be on the right side in that regard. And it seems as if expressing grievances about the Democrats is almost prohibited by certain constituencies right now. They feel like if you do that, then you're giving the election to Trump. And also there's the whole vote shaming phenomenon too of admonishing people who have checked out of the nonsense, because it is nonsense that's going on. What do you think about this phenomenon?
Well, I always love when people are like, make comments about how if you vote third party or you don't vote, that you're privileged, that this is like a statement on privilege. And I always think, I mean, it's obnoxious, but I also think it's just deeply, I guess it's at best ill-informed and more likely bad faith, because if you actually look at the people who don't vote, they're disproportionately lower income, they're disproportionately Black and brown. It has nothing to do with privilege. It has everything to do with looking at a system and saying, look, it hasn't really mattered whether it's been a Democrat or a Republican in the White House for me. It hasn't really made a difference. Yeah. And so I also, if there is one thing that I hate, it is voter shaming, because even just, again, from a strategic perspective, if you were trying to win someone over, you are never going to get there by shaming them and telling them they're awful and that they have privilege and all of these things. Like, that's not a winning argument that you're making there. But so much of the arguments that are made on Twitter and by a lot of prominent liberals aren't really about an outcome. They're not really about moving people. They're not really about building something or building towards some particular outcome. They're all just about a sort of public demonstration of their own virtue. Yep. And so, as long as
maybe they're signaling.
They're signaling
in all the right ways. Yeah. Then they're good. That's the only outcome they want, is to demonstrate their own sort of morality in the situation. So
it almost seems like an audition sometimes. It's uncanny, because I feel as if there's obviously this sort of obviously because of the polls and the fact that it looks like Biden is going to win, it almost seems as if people are auditioning for their spot within the sort of DNC pipeline in that regard, and they're kind of like positioning they're positioning that it's very scary, and it scares me too, because I've personally like remained sort of distant from the fray, and I feel like what the fuck's going to happen if this if things turn this way. But it seems as if people are auditioning for their place in the DNC pipeline because they see that that's where power is, and there's almost this nihilistic sort of resign towards this sort of tepid status quo, and a lot of the criticisms, because I remember you brought up the idea that the in Virginia the things that the Democrats did were largely sort of cultural, but the material was sort of obfuscated, and a lot of the things that these people sort of push in their voter shaming is the aesthetic and cultural domain of democratic policy, and why that's so important, and why you're somehow privileged for considering or being concerned about like the material. It is really sort of, and I mean I understand it, because in 2016 I was a child. I was like 20 or something, and
that's not how math works, Andy.
I don't know. I don't remember. I'm not good at math. Don't at me. Don't at me. Okay. I was very young. Okay. I was in college. Blah blah blah. And I was a liberal then, and I remember having a massive meltdown when Trump won. But now I sort of have a better understanding of what led people to just be like, no. And I was a Bernie Sanders supporter in 2016, but I was sort of on the vein of, well, Hillary Clinton's like the better alternative. Like, Trump is this like big bad, like Ganondorf style character that he's like the final boss that needs to be defeated. And now I see myself sort of having come out of that sort of rigid perspective, having had more interactions with people who are Trump supporters, some of whom are members of my own family, having really examined the domain of class, finding the anger and just the visceral disgust with the Democratic Party and how much they have obfuscated, you know, the concerns of the working class, just abhorrent, and understanding why people want to reject it, and also being disgusted at seeing sort of the way people have pivoted and bent the knee, to use those terms, but it's almost as if it's like being caught between a rock and a hard place. I understand both perspectives, but what do you think about this anger, and how do you think there's a sort of productive way to channel it?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's so obnoxious that not only is the expectation, okay, you're definitely going to vote for Joe Biden, and he doesn't have to do anything to earn your support. He deserves it. Like, you owe it to him. It is his right. Okay, so
were
first
you
of all,
in the
that's
basket? Were you in the basket of
Right,
deplorables?
And also, you're not black.
I'm do the right thing this time.
I'm not black either.
Right.
Oh, you're
Then
not
you ain't
black.
black.
You're not black.
I'm not black.
So that's like layer one of obnoxiousness. And then layer two of obnoxiousness is not only do you need to suck it up and vote for Joe Biden, but you have to be happy about it. You've got to be like elated about it and making the case for him and wearing your Biden Harris sticker and whatever else is required to be in good standing there. Like, there's this, I think it's Texas Roadhouse chain that they make their wait staff wear these t-shirts that say, "I love my job."
Yes.
I can't, guys. So triggered.
Yes.
Like, not only do they have to do the shitty job and like put up with all these like probably customers who like grab their ass or whatever happens to you as a tipped employee, but you have to wear a t-shirt that says, "I love my job." You have to perform like, not only am I going to do a good job and be a professional, but now I have to performatively love this. Like, no. And so that's kind of how I feel about Biden.
Yeah, it's very difficult to behold, and I'm sure it's even more difficult for the people who are sort of there on the ground now. But I mean, people just have to make whatever choice allows them to sleep at night. I'm not for voter shaming or, you know, making people feel bad about the decisions they make, but it does feel like forced fun. What the phenomenon you're describing is forced fun, basically.
Mandatory fun.
Mandatory.
You will vote for Joe and you will
love it.
And if you don't, Russia's paying
Yeah,
you.
exactly.
And if you're a leftist, you have to say, he wasn't my first choice.
But
Right. Yes. But now I love him.
Yes, now we stand. Now we all must stand.
it's interesting because I see the Russia stuff ramping up yet again, and I'm also seeing a lot of weird like Red Scare kind of anti-commie rhetoric as well ramping up from this sort of during this election, and that's yet another thing that's concerned me, is that there seems to be a lot of vitriol and disdain towards what is deemed as the radical left. Even though oftentimes in media and in the mainstream, what people view as the radical left are really just liberals or radicalized liberals. They don't really have any sort of left. They're not about economic populism. They have none of that. They're not interested.
Particularly angry liberals.
Yeah, particularly angry liberals is what they're talking about.
PALs. Pals.
Yeah, or rad libs, which is sort of the kind of colloquial term. But what do you think about this phenomenon in terms of trying to find a way to differentiate the actual sort of broad populist left from radical liberals and the neoliberal consensus? I feel like a lot of the demands that are being made is for us to sort of bend the knee to that mode and work as vassals for that mode, rather than sort of focusing our energies on strengthening our own mode. I really feel like we desperately need to differentiate those modes because they seem to be sort of weirdly intertwined at the moment. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, I mean, they want us just to be partisan, uncritical cheerleaders and just, you know, the idea right now is, I'm sure you see this, you get this on Twitter all the time too. It's like, just wait till after the election. Hold your fire, right? Hold your fire until after November 3rd, and then you can say whatever you want about Joe Biden. Of course, we all know that if November 3rd comes and goes and Joe Biden is in fact elected the next president of the United States, there might be like, first there's going to be a week where it's like, no, we have to celebrate this. Like, how can we be critical? It's celebration
Victory
time. And then the minute we move on from celebration time, then it's going to be like, but oh my God, we're about to have like Tucker Carlson, Tom Cotton 2024. So we can't have you criticizing now. Like, good God, you're going to destroy the country. You can't criticize ever. So whatever happens after Election Day, you just know that the next existential threat that is such a, horrible of horrors coming our way that will destroy the country is going to be just around the corner. And so they're going to start arguing once again that you can't possibly criticize, because if you do, you are aiding and abetting whatever this horrible of horrors is coming next. So that's what's going to happen.
Keep it open. Keep stuff coming out of it.
They want us just to be uncritical partisan cheerleaders always, because then, it's easy for them. They can just be slightly tiny bit better than Republicans, and we're supposed to be like, oh my God, thank you for not being quite as terrible as the Republicans are on every single issue.
Thanks for not being the Cheeto champ.
Way to go. Thank you. So, it is funny, though, to me when I read a lot of mainstream commentary. Oftentimes, there seems to be a lot of confusion about, like, liberals and the left, and, like, it all gets conflated together. And I'm like, who are you even talking about right now? Because I don't agree with those people. Like, don't put me in with that. I mean, I'm not with them. So I think there's definitely a lot of misunderstanding. I find a lot of older people in particular, I see this with Rising a lot, like Sagar's politics are kind of heterodox, having this like economic left positioning, but socially conservative, which is reflective of a lot of Americans, actually. They're completely unrepresented people who hold that view. But as you all know, there's a lot of people out there who are like pro-union, pro-healthcare, and also pro-life, right? Very common position to have. So he's not weird. It's just that he's weird in DC. And then even the fact in my politics that I'm not just a Team Blue cheerleader, that I'll criticize Joe Biden from the left, there's also a lot of like, that doesn't fit into my cable news model, so I don't understand it. So I even find with our Rising dynamic, a lot of older people in particular who are sort of steeped in that traditional cable news, like crossfire mode, find our politics so confusing that they just can't even like really wrap their heads around what we're up to.
Yeah, it's very strange because obviously we are in the sort of internet politics constituency. When you then face that visceral reality of people don't actually get what you're on about and they think you're crazy, it can be quite confronting. And I mean I remember I did an interview on a news network, and then I looked at the comments of what people were saying on the news network, and they were like, what is she talking about? Like what is like, is she a Russian agent? Like I didn't really I didn't realize it was sort of me confronting the fact that we really need to break shit down. And it's kind of one of the qualms I have about the Marxist circles that I run in, and my Marxist friends and the people who I tend to hang around, is that there's this sort of there's this sort of idea that breaking things down in a way that like the average, just somebody who's not even interested in politics at all can understand, is somehow obfuscating or somehow depriving them of being able to use their higher faculties, like all of those different arguments. But I feel like we really do need to break things down, and I feel like that's a lot of our focus needs to be on breaking things down in a way that's very easy for people to understand. And there are some people who are really good at that, and but it's a skill. It's something that is really, it's something that one has to cultivate and try really hard to do, because it's definitely not easy when you're dealing with these sort of complex political ideas, and especially when people have been fed this notion of right and left that's incredibly skewed and has absolutely nothing to do with politics. Like people think that right means family values, and people think that left means LGBTQ,
abolish the family.
Abolish the family, Black Lives Matter. They think that that's what left means, and it's those things are a component of the left, but it's not the core of what the left actually is. And I feel like we need to really sort of fight to claim that term. I mean, there are some people on the Marxist left who are like, we need to sort of get rid of the term left and call ourselves something else. But I don't want to surrender that territory. I feel like it's our territory and that we should claim that territory, and we shouldn't just sort of allow that territory to go towards liberals. What kind of, since you're on a show where there's two different perspectives, how do you find this issue intersects when you're dealing with people on the right wing, when they're sort of interacting with you? Do they talk to you and your positions, or do you see a lot of projection and sort of straw manning occur?
Well, it's funny because a lot of times they don't really know what to make of me either. Like, they'll kind of think I'm like an ally because I'm critical of Joe Biden or, the Democrats. And so there's this weird dynamic where a lot of Republicans will be like, oh, Krystal's really, really moderate. Like, she's really like very, she's very like in the center. And I mean, technically I am, because the economic views that we hold are the center of America. I mean, not all of my positions are popular, majoritarian, but many, many, many of them are actually the mainstream. But in common discourse, where I am on the ideological spectrum in American politics is definitely not in the center. So I always find that sort of funny. I was on Megyn Kelly's podcast, Sagar and I were on, and she introduced me as like Krystal Ball. She's like really, she's in the middle. She's very reasonable. And I'm like,
milk it. Don't let them know. Don't take the mask off.
The Joe Rogan
I didn't
moderate.
say anything. I was just like,
Right. Keep it.
Sure.
Keep it. Seriously.
Very reasonable.
Keep it. Seriously.
But I think that was kind of part of Bernie's superpower in 2016.
Yes.
And the way that he kind of like, screwed with people's brains a little bit, because they were like, okay, he's got these positions, but then he criticizes the Democrats. So like, it was this kind of like enemy of my enemy thing where they embrace him. And so even Fox News in the interim between 2016 and 2020, they'd have all this like sort of positively disposed towards Bernie content. Where it's like, he really got a raw deal. Know?
I mean,
My
even
dad
Trump
is a Trump voter and likes Bernie Sanders.
Yeah. There's a lot of
even Trump said it.
Where they're like, listen, they respect it.
Even Trump said it. I remember it was at a rally a few months ago where he was like, I would have been more frightened of a Bernie Sanders being an opponent. However, the Democrats like effed him basically, and it just goes to show that they. And
then he danced like SpongeBob.
He was like, then it just goes to show that they don't want an excited base, because he was afraid of Sanders having a base as excited as his base, basically. And he even sort of tilted his hat to Sanders in this sort of weird passive aggressive show of respect. So definitely, like, my mom, she's a card carrying Tory, and she also she could have voted in 2016, which was before we got our citizenship. But if she could have voted in 2016, she would have voted for Trump too. She even was partial to Bernie. Like, so many of them, it was like a no-brainer. It didn't even take much convincing. It wasn't even something you really. So many people who I know who are right-leaning people would have definitely voted for Sanders if that was the option that was proposed to them, for sure.
Yeah, and I really think a lot of that is just willingness to criticize, quote, your own side. And so I think part of what happened to him this time around was that the Democrats, because he lost ground with the white working class in particular, in Michigan and other industrial Midwestern states. In Michigan, Iowa, he didn't perform as well with like rural white voters in Iowa as he did last time around. And I do think a lot of that is because he kind of became too close to the Democratic Party. And they brought him in, they co-opted him, they made him whatever his policy, whatever. He was in the Senate, he had like an official title and was part of the Senate caucus and
outreach.
So they kind of brought him into the fold in a way that made him less of a rebel and less critical ultimately of the Democratic Party. And I think that was a little bit of, I don't know this is the whole piece of what went wrong, but I do think that is part of it. is that he became seen more as a conventional Democrat rather than as someone who would throw bombs at, whoever he thought was in the wrong.
Unless you're the Simpsons.
Yeah, it made him seem sort of unscrupulous in that regard to a lot of the people who saw him as an outsider or as somebody who was sort of critical of the status quo, which is unfortunate. But yeah, I mean, thank you so much for coming on, Krystal. You were a joy to talk to, and we hope to have you on again in future. It was a wonderful, wonderful conversation. Would you like to, obviously most of our audience probably listens to you already, but would you like to let people know where they can find you and plug anything you want to plug?
Absolutely. So on Twitter, I'm at Krystal Ball, Krystal with a K. And subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's The Hill on YouTube, and you can find Rising there.
Great. Thank you guys in the audience for listening. If you want to support the podcast, you can support us on Patreon. Check us out on Twitter. Defend us from getting cancelled on Reddit too. And check out lowsociety.net, where you can buy your vitamins and your apocalypse shelter. See you guys later. Bye.
Thanks,
Krystal.
Bye.
Thank you so much, Krystal. That was wonderful.